I was 51 years old the summer Boone Harker sent away for a wife, and I'd been riding for the Bar H long enough to know that a man who won't ask for help will sooner or later ask for it in the stupidest way he can find. Boone found his in a newspaper advertisement. I saw him write it. We were sitting on the porch after supper, his supper, which was beans burned to the bottom of the pot, and coffee you could have shot a horse with, and he had a stub of pencil and a scrap of butcher paper, and he was frowning at it the way he frowned at a fence that wouldn't stay strung. The barren pine stood up black against the last of the light on the ridge above us, the way it always did, that one crooked tree that had leaned into the wind so long it had given up standing straight, and never in the 20 years I'd known it had it dropped a single cone worth the name. "What ray you writing, Boone?" I asked him. "Nothing that concerns you, Purdy." Which meant it concerned me plenty, because everything on that ranch concerned me. I was the one who cooked when he didn't and mended when he wouldn't, and I was getting old enough that my knees told the weather better than the almanac did. So I leaned over and read it upside down, and what it said was, "Rancher, sound and solvent, seeks a practical woman for wife. Must cook, keep house, and manage accounts. No frills. Reply Bar H, Sage Fork." I laughed so hard I near fell off the step. "No frills," I said. "Boone, you put no frills in a proposal of marriage." "It's not a proposal. It's a notice." He folded it up small. "I need somebody to keep this place from falling in on itself. I'm losing money because I can't read my own figures at the end of a day, and I'm eating like a dog, and I'm not getting younger. A sensible woman would suit us both." "Us?" He gave me a look. "You want to keep cooking?" I did not. My beans were worse than his, if that was possible. So I shut my mouth and let him send his notice off to the territorial paper, and I figured, privately, that no woman with sense enough to read would answer a man who advertised for a wife the way you'd advertise for a wagon. I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about a great deal else, that whole long autumn, and it is the only time in my life I have been glad of it. 3 weeks later a letter came back. It was written in a hand so fine and even it looked printed, and Boone read it standing in the yard with his hat pushed back and a look on his face I couldn't name. He handed it to me without a word. "Mr. Harker," it said, "your notice is the least romantic thing I have ever read, which is precisely why I trust it. I am 31, in good health, and long past the age when a man's flattery would turn my head, so we may do without any. I can keep accounts better than most bankers. I cannot cook and will not pretend otherwise. If a burnt supper is a deal-breaker, say so now. I will arrive on the Sage Fork stage the 4th of September. Yours plainly, Junia Ashcombe." "Well," I said. "Well," Boone said. "She can't cook. Says so right there." He took the letter back and read it again, and I swear the corner of his mouth twitched, which for Boone Harker was the same as another man laughing out loud. "Honest, anyhow." "You wanted no frills," I said. "Sounds to me like you got a woman with no frills and a good deal of something else besides." He didn't answer that. He just folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket, over his heart, though I don't think he knew he did it, and he walked off to see about the water in the low tank, and the barren pine threw its crooked shadow down the ridge after him. The 4th of September came in hot and dry, the kind of high desert day where the air shimmers off the flats and the mountains float loose from the ground. Boone put on a clean shirt. I want that noted, because in the 20 years I'd known him I had seen him put on a clean shirt for a funeral and for nothing else, and here he was buttoning one to the throat to go and meet a woman he'd summoned like a May-lorder plow. We drove the buckboard into Sage Fork and waited by the stage office, and the whole town found a reason to be on that street when the coach came in, because word gets around, and there is nothing a frontier town loves like watching a proud man make a fool of himself over a woman. Ferris, who ran the mercantile, was sweeping a piece of boardwalk that didn't need it. The widow Cobb was inspecting a bolt of cloth in a window she'd walked past 1,000 times. Even the preacher, Reverend Stott, had drifted out to squint at the sky as though the Lord's business was suddenly conducted on Main Street. The stage came in trailing dust, and the driver hauled up the team and the door opened. The first thing off it was a trunk, then another trunk, then a crate the driver set down with a grunt and a word I won't repeat in front of a church, because it was heavier than it had any right to be, and when it hit the boards it went thump like a dropped anvil. "Careful of that one," said a woman's voice from inside the coach. "Those are books, and they cost me more than you make in a month." And then she stepped down. I will tell you what I expected, because you've likely got the same picture. Boone had advertised for practical, and I'd built a practical woman in my head, a stout, quiet body in gray, with her hair scraped back and her eyes down, the sort who'd take one look at the bar H and thank the Lord for a roof. That is not who came down the step of that stage. Junia Ashcombe was tall, and she came down straight-backed with a green traveling dress dusty to the knee, and she had a face that wasn't pretty in the soft way the word usually means, but was something better, quick, and clear, with a wide mouth made for saying exactly what she thought, and a pair of gray eyes that took in the whole street, the sweeping storekeeper and the window-shopping widow and the sky-squinting preacher, in about 2 seconds flat, and understood every one of them. Then those eyes landed on Boone, and Boone landed on his boots. "You'll be Mr. Harker," she said. It wasn't a question. "You have the look of a man who wrote no frills in a proposal." "It was a notice," Boone said, "not a proposal." "Yes, you said." "That's the part I liked." She put out her hand to shake, the way a man does, and after a second's hesitation Boone took it, and I watched the two of them stand there in the middle of the street shaking hands like a couple closing on a cattle deal, and I thought, Lord help us, this is going to be the making or the ruin of that man, and I don't yet know which. "This is Purdy," Boone said, remembering me. "He works the place with me." "Mr. Purdy." She shook my hand too, firm as a fence post, and up close her eyes had a warmth in them the sharp tongue hid. "I hope you're a better cook than I am, for all our sakes." "No, ma'am," I said honestly, "I'm about the same. Worse some days." She laughed at that, a real laugh, quick and low, and for just a second Boone looked at her sideways, surprised, the way a man looks up when a bird sings out of season. "Well," she said, surveying her trunks and her crate of books lined up on the boards, "it appears we're all going to starve together. That should make things simple." She turned to Boone. "Are we to be married today, or is there a decent interval before you find out what you've got?" Half the street was leaning in to hear his answer. Boone Harker went the color of a branding iron. "Reverend's expecting us Sunday," he managed. "Gives you time to look the place over. Change your mind if you've a mind to." "How generous," said Junia Ashcombe, in a tone that could have meant anything, and she climbed up onto the buckboard without waiting to be handed, and settled her skirts, and waited for us to load her books. The bar H is a long way out from Sage Fork, and I drove, and Boone and Junia sat in the back among the trunks because there wasn't room up front, and for the first 5 miles nobody said a word. Then the ranch came into view down the long slope, the low house, the barns, the corrals, the cattle strung out brown across the flats, and above it all on the ridge that one crooked tree. Junia looked at it a long moment. "What's that pine?" "That's just the pine," Boone said. "It's leaning. Wind." "It looks," she said, "like it gave up trying to be a tree and settled for surviving." She said it lightly, but I caught something under it, and so, I think, did Boone, because he didn't answer, and the pine went on leaning into a wind that wasn't blowing just then, out of pure old habit. The house was worse than I'd have let it be if I'd known company was coming. There were dishes I'll not describe, and a smell of old bachelor that no honest man will deny his house has, and Junia stood in the doorway and looked at it the way a general looks at ground he means to take. "Right," she said, and took off her traveling coat. "You don't have to start tonight," Boone said. "You've had a long ride." "Mr. Harker, if I sleep one night in this I'll lose my nerve." She rolled her sleeves to the elbow. Her forearms were a schoolteacher's, pale and strong. "Where's your soap?" There wasn't much. She sent me for more the next morning, and for a scrub, brush and lye and a great deal else, and she wrote out the list in that fine even hand and added at the bottom, in a firmer stroke, "And a stove that draws, if Ferris has one, for the love of God." Boone read that over my shoulder and got that iron brand color again. By the end of the week the house was a different house. I don't mean it was pretty. Junia had no more interest in pretty than Boone did. I mean it was ordered. The papers that had drifted into every corner were sorted into a box with dividers she'd made from a broken crate. The ledgers, Boone's ledgers, that he'd kept in a scrawl he himself could no longer read, were open on the table, and she was going through them line by line, and the third night she looked up and said, "Mr. Harker, you've been paying the Sage Fork Bank interest on a note you settled 2 years ago. They've had $400 of your money that isn't theirs." Boone stared at her. "That can't be right." "It can be right, and it is right. Here." She turned the book. "You paid the principal in the spring of '84. The bank kept charging interest as though it were open. Either their clerk is a fool or he's a thief, and I mean to find out which." She closed the book. "You'll ride in with me tomorrow, and we'll get it back. I want you to understand what that money was to Boone Harker. $400 in that country in that year was the difference between a hard winter and a broken one, and he had been bleeding it out slow for 2 years because he was too proud to let a soul see he couldn't read his own hand anymore. And here was a woman he'd known 5 days who'd found it in an evening by lamplight. He didn't thank her, that was Boone, but that night out on the porch he said to me low, "Purdy, she found $400. I heard. $400. He looked up at the ridge, at the black leaning shape of the pine. "I didn't send for that." "No," I said. "I don't reckon you did." Now here is the part I could tell wrong if I'm not careful, so I'll tell it plain. What Boone Harker had sent away for was a quiet woman to fill the hole where a wife should be. What he had gotten was Junia Ashcombe, who was not going to fill any hole quietly, and who had come west for reasons of her own that had nothing to do with Boone. She told me some of it over the weeks in that dry level way she had, while I mended tack and she snapped beans she still couldn't cook. She taught school back in Ohio, 14 years, and had been good at it, and had been let go not for any fault, but because the town fathers had decided a schoolmistress past 30 and unmarried was an embarrassment, a sort of standing rebuke to the natural order, and they'd hired a married man half as able and paid him twice as much. She'd had no family to fall back on and no husband to be kept by and no wish, she said, to become the poor relation in some cousin's back bedroom, sewing other women's babies' clothes till she died. "So I read the notices," she said, "and every one of them was some man saying loving Christian companion must be fair of face, and then there was yours, no frills." She snapped a bean. "A man who wants a bookkeeper and won't lie about it. I thought there, at least, is a man I can do business with. If he's a brute I'll leave, but at least he's an honest brute." "He's not a brute," I said. "No." She looked out the window toward where Boone was working a green colt in the corral, patient as stone, the way he was with anything young and scared. "No, he isn't. He's something I didn't advertise for either." And she snapped another bean and wouldn't say more. They didn't marry that Sunday. It was Junia who put it off, not Boone, which set the town's tongue wagging worse. "I'll not marry a man I've known 9 days," she told him flat. "The notice was business. The marriage is my whole life. I want to know you first." And Boone, who I think was half relieved and half stung, said fine, and gave her the little bedroom that had been his mother's, and took the bunkroom off the barn with me, and there they were, a rancher and the woman he'd sent for, living under one roof and not married, and the whole of Sage Fork scandalized and delighted. It was Junia who didn't care a fig. "Let them talk," she said. "They talked in Ohio too. I've found the talk is the same everywhere and means the same nothing. But it wasn't nothing, not entirely, and it came to a head over the school. Because Junia Ashcombe had not stopped being a teacher, just because Ohio had stopped paying her to be one. Within a month, she'd learned that there were 19 children in the Sage Fork district and no school, the last teacher having married and quit and none come to replace her, and the children running wild or set to work. And Junia looked at that the way Boone looked at a downed fence, as a thing that was simply wrong and had to be fixed by whoever was standing nearest. "I mean to open a school," she told us at supper, a supper I had cooked badly. "There's the old freight shed at the edge of town that nobody uses. I'll clean it out. I've books enough to start, and the parents can pay in eggs and firewood if they've no cash, and I'll teach 3 days a week and keep your accounts the other 3, Mr. Harker, and everyone will be the better for it." Boone put down his fork. "You came here to keep house. I came here to be your wife when I've made up my mind to it, and to keep your house and your books, all of which I am doing. What I do with the rest of my time is my own affair. It'll set the town against you. The town is already against me. I'm an unmarried woman living in a bachelor's house. If I'm to be talked about, I'd rather be talked about for teaching children than for warming your hearth." She held his eye. "Do you forbid it?" And here is where I learned something about Boone Harker I hadn't known in 20 years, because he could have forbidden it. In that country, in that year, a man's word in his own house was law, and no one would have blinked if he'd said no. I saw him think about it. I saw the old solitary hardness come up in him, the part that wanted the quiet woman he'd advertised for, and not this whirlwind who'd blown into his life and started rearranging the furniture of it. And then I saw him let it go. "No," he said, "I don't forbid it." He picked his fork back up. "But that shed's got a hole in the roof you could throw a cat through. You'll not teach children under a hole in the roof. I'll come Saturday and fix it." Junia looked at him a long moment across the bad supper. Something moved in her face that I hadn't seen there before, surprise. And under the surprise, something warmer that she wasn't ready to name any more than he was. "Thank you, Mr. Harker," she said quietly. "Boone," he said, not looking up. "If you're going to fix my books and teach the whole county, you might as well call me Boone." He fixed the roof that Saturday, and I helped, and Junia scrubbed 14 years of freight dust out of that shed while we hammered, and by the following week there was a school in Sage Fork for the first time in 2 years. 19 children the first day, 23 the second, as word spread. She taught them letters and figures, and on Fridays, whatever she pleased, the names of the stars, the way a river cuts a canyon, poems she knew by heart and recited standing on a crate so the little ones in back could see her face. I went in once to bring her a forgotten dinner pail and stood in the door and watched. She had a boy at the board, a rough, freckled thing named Toby Rell, whose father was the meanest drunk in the district, and she was walking him through a sum he'd got wrong, patient, until he got it right, and when he did she didn't gush over him. She just said, "There, you had it all along. You only had to slow down," and Toby Rell looked up at her like she'd handed him the world. I told Boone about it that night. He didn't say much, but I noticed that from then on, when we hauled wood, there was always an extra load that went to the school, and he never said a word about it, and neither did I. The thaw between those two was the slowest, stubbornest thing I ever watched, and the sweetest, and I had a front row seat to every inch of it. It came in flashes. It came the night the North Pasture caught a grass fire off a lightning strike, and the 3 of us fought it till dawn with wet sacks and shovels. And when it was out and we were black to the eyebrows and half dead, Junia sat down in the scorched grass and started to laugh, and Boone sat down beside her and started to laugh too. The pair of them filthy and exhausted and laughing like fools at nothing, at being alive. And I thought, there it is, and got up and left them to it. It came the day Boone found her out by the corral with a book, and instead of asking why the accounts weren't done, sat down on the rail and said, "What were you reading?" And she read it to him, out loud, a passage about the sea, which neither of them had ever seen, and they sat there in the dry high desert 1,000 miles from any ocean and imagined it together till the light went. It came, more than anything, the evening I told her about Ellen. She'd asked me, careful, the way you ask about a wound, whether Boone had ever been married. And I told her the truth because I thought she had a right to it. That Boone Harker had married once, young, a girl named Ellen from over in the Rimrock country, and that Ellen had died in her second winter on the Bar H, of a fever that took her in 4 days and the child with her, unborn. That Boone had buried them both under the barren pine on the ridge, because it was the only tree on the place tall enough to mark the spot, and that he'd never spoken Ellen's name aloud in the 19 years since, and never courted another woman, and had by all appearances made up his mind to grow old alone up there under that crooked tree with his dead. Until the notice, Junia said. Until the notice. She was quiet a long time. That's why he wrote it that way, she said finally. No frills, no love talk. Because he'd loved once and it was buried on that ridge, and he wouldn't pretend to feel it again for a stranger. He wanted a partner, not a replacement for Ellen. He was being honest. Her voice had gone soft. The most honest thing I ever read, and I mistook it for coldness. He's not cold, I said again. No, she said. He's the opposite of cold. He's a man so afraid of the fire that he stood out in the snow 19 years. She looked up at the ridge, at the pine black against the stars, with the 2 graves under it that I had shown her once, and she had stood at a long while with her head bowed. The poor stubborn man. I have to tell you now about the hard part of that autumn, because there was one, and it's where the whole thing turned. The trouble came from a man named Duvall Crane, who ran the Sage Fork Bank, the same bank whose clerk had been quietly bleeding Boone of interest for 2 years. When Junia had gone in and got the $400 back, she'd done it in front of half the town, laying the ledgers open on the counter and walking Crane's own clerk through the theft line by line, until the man had gone white and Crane himself had come out of his office, and, red as fire, refunded every dollar rather than have the whole street hear it argued. Duvall Crane was not a man who forgave being made to look a thief in his own bank by a woman, and he was, besides, one of the town fathers who thought an unmarried schoolmistress a scandal and a menace, and he set himself, quiet and patient, to be rid of her. He did it the coward's way. He didn't come at Junia. He went around to the parents of her 23 children, 1 and 2 at a time, and he reminded them. A banker reminds you of things gently, with his hand on your note, that Miss Ashcombe was an unmarried woman living unwed in a bachelor's house, that no decent family ought to hand its children over to a person of such loose habits, that there were mortgages to think of and a man standing in the community. And wouldn't it be a shame if the school were to become a thing that respectable folk kept their young ones clear of? It worked the way that kind of poison always works, slow and then all at once. One Monday Junia had 23 children, the Monday after she had 11, the Monday after that 6. She didn't say a word about it at first. I only knew because I saw her walking home from town one evening later than usual, alone on the road with the light dying, and when she came into the yard, her face was set the way a face gets when it has been holding something back a long while, and she went straight to her room and didn't come out for supper. It was Boone who went and knocked on her door. I'd never seen him do such a thing. I couldn't hear what was said, but he was in there a good while, and when they both came out at last her eyes were red and his jaw was set like a stone, and Boone Harker said to me, "Purdy, saddle my horse. I'm going into town. Now it's near dark. Now, what are you going to do?" He put on his hat. "I'm going to marry that woman," he said, "if she'll have me, and then I'm going to see Duvall Crane." I looked at Junia. She was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed tight, and she wasn't crying anymore. She was looking at Boone the way I hadn't dared hope she'd ever look at him, and she said, "You'll not marry me to save my school, Boone Harker. I won't be married for a reason. I've had enough of men doing things to me for reasons. I know it, Boone said. Then why? And Boone Harker, who had not spoken his first wife's name in 19 years, who had advertised for a woman with no frills because he could not bear to pretend a feeling twice, stood in his own doorway with his hat in his hand, and said the bravest thing I ever heard a man say. Because I want to, he said. Not for the school, not for the books, nor the house, nor the county's opinion. I've stood out in the snow a long time, Junia. I made up my mind years back I'd stay there, and I was content to, or told myself I was. And then you came down off that stage with a crate of books and told me my coffee was fit to shoe a horse, and you've been in every room of my life since, and this last month I've caught myself. He stopped. His voice had gone rough. I've caught myself laughing. First time in 19 years. And I don't want to stop. I don't want you married to me for a reason. I want you married to me because I've gone and because I love you, and it took a schoolteacher to make me admit it, and now I've said it and I'll not say it better, so there it is. The yard was dead quiet. Even the wind had dropped. Up on the ridge the barren pine stood black and crooked and still. Junia Ashcombe crossed that yard and took his face in both her strong, pale schoolteacher's hands and kissed him, once, and I turned around and studied the barn very hard, because a man ought to have that moment to himself, or as much to himself as he can with an old fool of a hired hand standing 10 feet off. You, she said when she'd let him go, are the most impossible man I have ever met, and I have met a great many, and I came out here meaning never to give my whole life into any man's keeping again. She was crying and laughing at once now, the way she'd laughed in the scorched grass. And I find I don't want to keep it from you. I don't want to keep anything from you. Yes. Yes, you great stubborn thing, I'll marry you, but not to save the school. She stepped back and wiped her eyes, and something of the old sharpness came back into them, and it was glorious. I'll save the school myself. She did too, but that's a little ahead. They were married that Sunday in the Sage Fork Church by Reverend Stott, and the town came, every soul of it, even the parents who'd pulled their children out, even Dovell Crane, sitting stiff in a back pew, because a wedding is a wedding and folks will come to one out of pure appetite for spectacle if nothing else. Junia wore the green traveling dress. She said she'd arrived in it and she'd marry in it, and that was that. Boone wore his one clean shirt. I stood up with him because there was no one else, and my hands shook worse than his. And when Reverend Stott asked was there any who objected, there was a silence, and into that silence, before Crane or anyone could so much as clear a throat, Junia Ashcombe turned around from the altar and looked out over the whole congregation and spoke. Since we're all here, she said, pleasant as anything, and since I know some of you have wondered whether a married woman is fit to teach your children where an unmarried one was not, I'll be reopening the school Monday. Same shed, same hours. My husband has patched the roof. I'll expect your children back, and I'll not charge a cent more than eggs and firewood, and I'll teach them their letters and their figures and, God willing, a little sense besides. Those of you who kept your young ones home on Mr. Crane's advice might ask yourselves what a banker knows about educating a child, and why he was so anxious you shouldn't have it done. She smiled sweetly at Dovell Crane, whose face had gone the color of a beet. Reverend, you may go on. I have never in my life heard a church so quiet, and then I have never heard one laugh so hard, because the whole town understood in one breath exactly what had been done to them, and exactly who had done it. And there is nothing a hard country loves better than watching a proud rich man get taken down by a sharp poor woman in front of God and everybody. They laughed till the rafters rang. Dovell Crane got up and left before the vows were done, and I don't believe he ever got his standing back. And Junia Harker had 23 children in her school by the following Wednesday and 26 by the end of the month. That is how Boone Harker's Maylorder marriage began, with the whole town roaring and the bride running her own campaign from the altar rail. And if you think that is not a love story, then you have never loved anybody with a mind of her own. The winter that came was a hard one, the way they always were up under the barren pine, and it was the first winter in 20 that I didn't dread. The house was warm and ordered and full of the smell of wood smoke, and Lord help us of cooking, because Junia had decided somewhere along the way that being unable to cook was one more thing the world had told her she couldn't do, and she'd be damned if she'd take the world's word for it. And she set out to learn it the way she set out to learn anything, methodical and stubborn, with a book propped open on the flour bin. Her first bread could have been used to chock a wagon wheel. Her 10th was fair. By spring she was turning out biscuits that made me weep, and Boone ate 3 at a sitting and never said a word, which from Boone Harker was a serenade. And the 2 of them. I watched the 2 of them all that winter, and I will tell you it was not the soft cooing kind of love the story papers sell. They argued. Lord, how they argued about the books, about the school, about whether the North Herd should be moved, about a line of poetry, about everything under the sun. Both of them too sharp and too stubborn to ever let the other have the last word easy. But it was the arguing of 2 people who'd rather be arguing with each other than agreeing with anybody else in the world. And every argument ended the same way, with the pair of them worn out and grinning. And I learned that some folks love best with their sleeves rolled up. The tender came in the quiet times. It came the night Boone took her up the ridge to the 2 graves under the pine, walked her up there through the snow and stood beside her, and for the first time in 19 years said Ellen's name out loud. I wasn't there. He told me after some of it more than he'd ever told me of anything. He said he'd been afraid Junia would think he was giving her a lesser share, the second wife, the practical arrangement, the woman who came after. And that Junia had stood at Ellen's grave a long while and then said to him, quiet, I'm not jealous of her, Boone. She loved you when you were young enough to give it easy. I love you now that it's hard for you and you've given it anyway. That's the greater gift, and I know it, and I don't need to be first. I only need to be true. And that Boone had put his arm around her there in the snow between the 2 graves, and the living wife and the dead one had, in some way he couldn't say, made a kind of peace over that crooked tree. He said the strangest thing then. He said, you know that pines never dropped a cone, whole time I've known it. Ellen used to say it was a sad old thing standing up there barren year on year. I always figured it'd never bear. Figured some things just don't. Some things just take a long winter, Junia said. She was right. I have thought about it many times since, and I have decided she was right about a great deal, but never more right than that. Because that next spring, the first spring of their marriage, when the snow went off the ridge and the ground softened, and I climbed up to the graves to clear the winter's fall of needles the way I did every year, I looked up into the crooked old barren pine, that tree that had leaned into the wind so long it forgot how to stand straight, that tree that in 20 years I had never seen bear a single cone worth the name. And it was hung with them, green cones, small and tight and new, all up and down the wind-bent branches, more than I could count, the whole crooked length of it heavy with them for the first time in the memory of any living soul. I stood there a long time. Then I went down and got the 2 of them and brought them up the ridge without telling them why, and Boone Harker looked up into that tree, and I watched 20 years go off his face. Well, he said, which was all he ever said about anything that mattered. Junia didn't say anything at all. She just took his hand, and the 2 of them stood under the barren pine that wasn't barren anymore, with the 2 graves at their feet and the whole green weight of it above them. And I thought about a hard, solitary man who'd sent away for a practical wife because he'd given up on anything more, and a sharp, proud woman who'd come out to be a bookkeeper because the world had told her she was past being loved, and how the 2 of them, who'd expected so little, had built a thing neither one had dared to advertise for. They named their first child Ellen. It was Junia who chose it and Boone who wept, though he'd deny it to his grave, and I'll let him. There were 3 more after that, and every one of them learned their letters at Junia Harker's school, and the eldest, Ellen, grew up sharp and clear-eyed as her mother and stubborn and gentle as her father, and when she was grown she took over the school herself, and it is running yet. Boone and Junia grew old on that ranch under the pine, and I grew old with them, an uncle to their children and a fixture on their porch, and I never once cooked another supper, which I count among the great mercies of my life. He never got less gruff and she never got less sharp, and they never stopped arguing, and they never, not once in 40 years, stopped preferring each other's company to anyone's on earth. I buried Boone under the pine, beside Ellen and the child, when his time came, and Junia stood at the grave dry-eyed and straight-backed the way she'd come down off that stage all those years before. And afterward she said to me the truest thing anybody ever said about the two of them. He advertised for no frills, she said, looking up into the tree that was hung that autumn heavy with cones, and I answered because I was done with pretty lies. She put her hand flat against the crooked old trunk, and we found out, he and I, that there's nothing in this world plainer than the truth, and nothing on God's earth more beautiful. He'd have hated me saying so. He'd have loved it, I said. He just wouldn't have said. No, Junia Harker agreed, and for a moment she smiled the quick low smile she'd smiled at me on the boardwalk in Sage Fork the first day, 40 years gone. He never did say things. He just fixed the roof. She lies up there now too, beside him, under the pine that bears every year, and I am an old, old man, and when my own time comes they'll carry me up that ridge and set me down near the four of them, and I'll count it an honor. There's no finer company in the country than a man who fixed the roof rather than say he loved you, and the woman who was smart enough to know what that meant. The tree's still standing, still leaning, still bearing, heavier every year, that old barren pine that everyone but Junia had given up on. She always did say it only wanted a long winter. I've come to think most things do.